The chamber was carved from the hollow core of a dead moon. That was the first thing I noticed when the transport doors slid open and I stepped onto the arrival platform. Not the 17 thrones arranged in a perfect crescent ahead of me. Not the translucent dome above, showing a field of stars I had only ever seen on charts. Not the dozens of alien eyes turning toward me all at once. It was the rock. Ancient, pitted, black as old iron. The walls had not been smoothed or decorated. Whoever built this place wanted everyone inside it to feel the weight of what surrounded them. Stone that had floated in silence for 1 billion years, before anyone thought to hollow it out and hold court inside. I walked toward the center podium and I did not hurry. My name is Yara Voss. I am 38 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, and I had been awake for 22 hours by the time I stood in the middle of the galactic conclave for the first time in human history. I had a headache. My boots were slightly too tight. I had not eaten since the transit ship. None of that mattered, and I reminded myself of that with every step I took across the stone floor. The sound of my footsteps echoed, actual echoes, which meant the chamber had been designed for silence, for the kind of silence that makes every sound feel like a statement. I understood that. It was not so different from walking into a courtroom back on Earth, where the architecture itself is a form of pressure, where everything about the space says, "You are small here, and we are watching." I was small here. I was also the only human being in a room of 53 alien delegates representing 17 known species, and I was there because something had happened 6 months ago that no one in this chamber could explain without my help. Grand Arbiter Sekthal of the Vorathi Dominion spoke first. I had read his file on the transit. He was approximately 400 years old by human reckoning, which among the Vorathi made him middle-aged. His form was tall and angular, draped in a garment that shifted color slowly, like oil on water. His voice, when the translation system delivered it into my earpiece, was low and perfectly even, the kind of voice that has never needed to raise itself to be obeyed. "Human," he said, "you are here at the request of this council to provide an account of events that occurred in your solar system 6 months prior to this session. 17 vessels belonging to the Kreth Collective entered your system under the authority of a lawful integration order. They have not returned. Their communications ceased within 11 hours of arrival. You will explain this." He did not say please. I had not expected him to. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked slowly around the room, taking in each delegation in turn. The Sulanics cluster to my left, their bodies a shifting mass of connected nodes that voted as a single unit. The Pellucid, translucent and perfectly still, 3 of them standing like glass sculptures behind their carved podium. The Kethvari, whom I almost missed because they were small and seated in the back row, their clicking language already moving through a translator, even though no one had addressed them. I looked at all of them the way my grandmother used to look at a room before she spoke in it, taking its measure, deciding what it deserved. Then I pulled out the chair at the center podium. Nobody had told me there was a chair. Nobody had told me I was allowed to sit. I sat down anyway. I set my hands flat on the table and looked at Arbiter Sekthal with the clearest expression I could manage. Not hostility, not submission, not anything he had probably seen from a new species before. "I will explain," I said, "but I need you to understand something first. Because without this piece, none of the rest of it will make sense to you." I paused, not for drama, because I was genuinely trying to figure out where to begin with people who had never met us, never studied us, never done anything except receive a very alarming report 6 months ago about a fleet that went somewhere and did not come back. "You assumed," I said, "that when the Kreth Collective sent 17 ships to our solar system, we would not be ready for them. I want to understand why you assumed that. Because it matters. You knew we existed. You knew we had developed interstellar communication. You knew our planet had nations, governments, a history of internal disagreement. And from that, you concluded we were unprepared. I need to know what that conclusion was built on, because it tells me something very important about how you see us, and that matters a great deal for the conversation we are about to have." Sekthal's color-shifting garment went still for a moment. I noted that. I noted it the way I had been trained to note things, quietly and without reaction. The Kreth Collective's assessment, he said carefully, was based on standard integration protocols. Your species had achieved Level 3 interstellar awareness, but had not yet registered with the Conclave. You had no recorded defensive fleet of interstellar capability. You had not responded to the integration invitation with either acceptance or formal rejection. Under Conclave law, a non-response constitutes grounds for compliance enforcement. Right, I said. And who told you we had no defensive fleet? The silence that followed was not long, but it was the kind of silence that means everyone in the room just arrived at the same thought at the same moment. The Kreth assessment, Sekthal said again, more quietly this time. Yes, I said. The Kreth assessment. Based on what the Kreth were able to observe. Which brings me to the thing I need you to understand before we go any further. I leaned forward slightly. We knew, the moment we received the Kreth invitation 8 years ago, that we were being watched. We knew that anything visible from space, any fleet we built in orbit, any weapons platform we constructed near Earth, would be cataloged and reported. So we made a decision. We built nothing visible, and we said nothing about what we were doing. For 6 years. And what I am about to tell you is the result of that decision. Around me, the chamber was completely and absolutely still. I let that stillness sit for 3 more seconds. Then I said, the Kreth Collective did not lose 17 ships to a lucky accident, or a systems failure, or a mistake. They lost 17 ships because we were waiting for them, and I think it is time you heard the full story of how that happened, and why, and what humanity intends to do next. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Somewhere in the translation systems around the room, software was working very hard. I thought about Admiral Dae-Jung Park, sitting somewhere on the other side of this dead moon in a waiting room with cold coffee and a book she was probably not reading. I thought about the 6 years of work that had brought us to this chamber. I thought about my father, who had been an engineer, who had spent his entire career building things meant to last, and who had told me once that the most important thing about any structure is not how impressive it looks, but whether it holds when the weight comes down. The weight had come down 6 months ago. It had held. Let me start, I said, 8 years ago. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. I know that sounds like a strange detail to remember, but the day of the week matters when you are trying to explain how humans process information, because it tells you something about the ordinary texture of life that was interrupted. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring, Northern Hemisphere time. A deep space listening array in the outer belt, operated by a joint research consortium, picked up a tightly compressed signal from a direction that did not correspond to any known natural source. It was decoded within 4 hours. It was on the desk of every major government on Earth within 6. I was not involved at that stage. I was finishing a posting with the Unified Earth Defense Council as a strategy analyst, working on threat scenarios that everyone treated as theoretical. I remember reading the summary document late that Tuesday evening and feeling something I can only describe as a very cold clarity. Not fear. Fear is reactive, loud, immediate. This was something quieter. The feeling of watching a probability that everyone had pretended was low become suddenly, undeniably real. The message from the Kreth Collective was written in what their systems apparently believed was a welcoming format. They introduced themselves. They described the Galactic Conclave and its membership benefits. They listed what they called integration requirements, which included the surrender of independent military authority, the opening of Earth's resource surveys to Conclave auditors, and the adoption of a governance framework that would align Earth's decision-making with Conclave standards within 15 years. At the end, almost as an afterthought, they noted that a response was expected within 3 years, and that failure to respond would be interpreted as acceptance of the process by default. That last sentence was what told us everything we needed to know. I presented my analysis to the Defense Council 3 days later. My conclusion was simple. This was not an invitation. It was a timeline. The Kreth Collective, acting as the Conclave's enforcement arm, had given us 3 years to accept, after which they would consider the matter settled regardless of what we said. The actual integration, meaning the arrival of ships and personnel to begin implementing conclave authority, would follow as a formality. We were not being asked. We were being processed. The room was quiet after I finished. General Owen Hartley, who had commanded Earth's combined defense forces for 9 years, and who had the kind of face that looked as if it had been carved from patience, asked me one question. How long do we have before they come? Assuming they come. I told him my estimate was 6 to 8 years, long enough for them to receive our non-response, classify it, decide on a fleet composition, and travel to us. Maybe a bit more if there were political delays within the collective. Maybe a bit less if they were efficient. He nodded once. Then he asked the room what we intended to do with that time. That conversation lasted 11 hours. I was there for all of it. By the end, we had the beginning of what would eventually be called Operation Quiet Sky, a program that did not officially exist, that was not recorded in any document accessible to open networks, and that consumed more engineering talent, more funding shifted through quiet budget lines, and more careful, patient, disciplined secrecy than anything Earth had ever attempted in its history. The core idea was straightforward. We could not build a visible defense. Anything in orbit or near Earth would be detected and reported back to the Creth before their fleet ever left home. So we would not build near Earth. We would build in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, deep inside the rock and ice, in spaces where no external observer could distinguish a construction facility from a natural formation. We would use no open communications. We would rotate personnel on dark transit ships that ran with no active emissions. We would take our time, do it right, and be ready when the moment came. The moment we were building toward was not a war. I want to be clear about that, because I think the conclave may have concluded otherwise, and they would be wrong. We were not preparing to take anything from anyone. We were preparing to still be ourselves when someone came to take that from us. There is a difference, and it is not a small one. What made the program work was not money, though there was a great deal of money behind it. It was not the engineering, though the engineering was extraordinary. What made it work was the people. The kind of people Earth produces when it is genuinely afraid and has decided to do something about that fear in a disciplined and practical way. I think this is the part that is hardest to explain to a room full of species who evolved in more stable circumstances. Humanity spent most of its history in conflict with itself, not because we were uniquely cruel, but because we were adaptable, and competition was for a very long time the primary engine of our development. We disagreed over land, over resources, over ideas, and from all of that, over centuries, we built up a kind of deep, practical, hard-won understanding of conflict that became part of how we think the way music becomes part of a culture. You do not have to be a musician to understand rhythm. You do not have to have been in a war to carry the understanding of it in the way you plan and prepare. General Hartley understood this when he chose the team leads for Quiet Sky. He did not look for the most aggressive people. He looked for the most patient ones, the ones who could work for years toward a goal without external validation, without knowing if it would matter, without the comfort of being able to talk about what they were doing. The engineers who worked in the belt for 3, 4, 5 years on rotation knew what they were building and why. They went anyway. They were quiet about it. And they were good. Caroline Webb ran the primary construction teams from year 2 through year 5. She was 44 when she started, a structural engineer who had built deep-sea habitats and polar research stations, and who approached the problem of building warships inside asteroids with the same calm, methodical attention she brought to everything else. She never raised her voice. She solved problems by taking them apart into pieces small enough to hold in one hand, addressing each piece, and then assembling the solution. The ships she built were the result of 600 people working in cold and darkness for years, and they were extraordinary. Peter Lane ran propulsion. He was 30 years old when he was recruited, the youngest lead on the project, chosen because his research on low-emission drive systems had produced a propulsion architecture that could move a large ship with a thermal signature, small enough to be indistinguishable from natural rock temperature variation. The Creth, when they came, would be looking for engine heat. They would find nothing. There were hundreds of others: weapons designers, navigation specialists, medical teams, logistics coordinators who managed the supply chain without leaving a trail that anyone observing from outside could follow. Each of them knew they were doing something important. None of them knew exactly how it would end. What they built, over 6 years, was a fleet, not enormous by interstellar standards, but it was enough. 23 ships of various classes, from heavy interceptors to smaller fast-response craft, all designed for the specific conditions of our solar system, all crewed by people who had trained together in the belt and knew their ships and each other, with the kind of understanding that only comes from shared difficulty over a long time. Admiral Dae-jung Park took command of the fleet in its final year of preparation. She was 61 years old. She had commanded forces in 3 different regional conflicts before the Unified Earth Defense Council was formed, and she had been living with the Quiet Sky Project in an advisory capacity since year 3. When she stepped onto the bridge of the lead ship for the first time, the crew chief told me later that she looked at every corner of that bridge for about 30 seconds without saying anything, then turned to the crew and said, "Good. Now let us make sure we never have to use this." She meant it. She genuinely hoped they never had to. She was also completely ready for the moment they did. I need to stop here and say something about what it took to keep all of this secret for 6 years, because I do not think anyone in the conclave chamber fully appreciated it, and it matters. 600 people worked in the asteroid belt during the construction phase. Over the full run of the program, counting rotations, supply personnel, communication coordinators, and the Defense Council members who had oversight of the project, approximately 2,000 individual human beings knew that Quiet Sky existed. Not all of them knew all of it, but they knew enough. They knew that Earth was building a fleet in secret. They knew that the fleet was intended to defend against a potential alien enforcement action. They knew that if the program was discovered before it was ready, everything would be lost. Not one of them talked. 2,000 people, for 6 years, said nothing. I have thought about this many times since, and I think the reason it worked is not simply that people were afraid to talk, though the security protocols were serious. The reason it worked is that people understood why silence was necessary, and they chose it. There is a difference between compliance and commitment. The people in Quiet Sky were committed. They had looked at the situation, understood the stakes, decided what mattered most, and then lived accordingly. That is what humans do, when the thing at risk is something we genuinely care about. The thing at risk was Earth. 6 years of silence later, the fleet was ready, and the Kreth arrived. The moment came on a Thursday morning, 03:47 hours, ship time, which is the hour when exhaustion presses hardest on even the most disciplined crew, when the body wants to be somewhere else, and the mind has to work to stay sharp. Park had anticipated this. She had rotated everyone to maximum rest states in the 48 hours before the expected window. When the long-range sensors registered 17 gravity signatures emerging from deep space transit, the crew of every ship in the hidden fleet was awake, fed, and as ready as human beings can be when the thing they have spent years preparing for is finally, actually happening. I was not in the belt when the engagement occurred. I was on Earth, in a secure communications facility outside Geneva, in a room with 12 other members of the Defense Council, watching the relay feeds come in. The feeds were delayed by several minutes due to the distance involved, which meant we were always watching the past, never the present. We knew this going in. We had planned for it. Park had full operational authority. Our job was to watch, document, and be ready to respond to whatever came next on the diplomatic side. The Kreth fleet came in at standard approach velocity for a compliance mission. This was the first confirmation of something we had hoped. They were not running a combat approach. They were running a routine enforcement deployment. 17 ships in a textbook integration formation, 2 lead vessels out front, 12 in close formation behind, 3 holding at the outer boundary as communication relay. Park noted this immediately. She said to her navigation team, "Standard compliance approach. They are not expecting resistance. Keep everyone cold until I give the word." Nobody moved. Nobody broadcast anything. 23 ships sat inside their rock hiding places. cold and still and invisible, and waited. The Kreth lead vessel crossed the boundary between the outer belt and the inner system at 0541 hours. At 0614, it reached a point between Mars and the asteroid belt and broadcast the integration notice. The message went to every government on Earth simultaneously. It was polite in its language and absolute in its content. It stated that the integration timeline had officially begun, that Kreth administrative personnel would begin arriving within 30 days, that Earth's existing defense and governance structures would be transitioned into the collective's framework over the following 15 years, that cooperation was expected, and that any resistance would be met with proportional response from the enforcement fleet now present in the system. I have read that message many times since. I always stop at that last line. Proportional response. As if they had calculated exactly how much force it would take to manage a planet that had no visible fleet, no interstellar combat capability, and no history of organized resistance to external authority. As if the number had been worked out in advance and was very, very small. Admiral Park read the message at 0619. At 6:20, she opened the fleet-wide channel for the first and only time before the engagement began. She said 4 sentences. I have them memorized. They are in range. They are not expecting us. We have done everything right. And this is what it was for. On my mark. A 4-second pause. Mark. From 23 positions inside the asteroid belt, the entire hidden fleet fired simultaneously. The first salvo had been designed for the lead formation. Caroline Webb's engineers and Peter Lena's propulsion team had spent 18 months on the targeting architecture, a system that could coordinate fire from ships separated by thousands of kilometers and deliver simultaneous impacts with a margin of error small enough to ensure that no target had time to respond to the first hit before the second arrived. The Kreth lead ships were large, well-armored, and crewed by people who believed they were on a routine mission. Their point defense systems were in standby mode. There was nothing to scan for. The first 3 ships were disabled in under 8 seconds. What followed was not clean or orderly. It was fast and complicated and loud in the way that all real engagements are. Because no matter how precisely you plan, the moment it starts, circumstances shift, and the people involved have to think faster than any plan, and trust their preparation, and hold their positions when everything around them is moving. Park's fleet did all 3. The Kreth formation scattered, tried to regroup, tried to raise defenses, tried to communicate back to the relay ships at the boundary. Earth's ships moved out of the belt for the first time, using the cover of the remaining rock and their low-emission drives to close distance before the Kreth could fully track their positions. It was over in 41 minutes. 14 Kreth ships were disabled, not destroyed. That distinction was deliberate, planned before the engagement began, written into Park's standing orders for every ship captain in the fleet. Disable. Do not destroy where it can be avoided. The reasoning was simple, and it was entirely Park's own. We were not at war with the Kreth Collective. We were ending an unauthorized incursion into our sovereign space. Those are different things, and the difference should be legible in what we chose to do when we had the choice. The Kreth crews inside the 14 disabled ships were alive and unharmed. Earth's boarding teams reached them in the hour following the engagement and found personnel in various states of shock, none of them injured by anything other than the disorientation of a situation they had not expected and could not yet fully process. They were provided with medical attention, water, food, and translation support. They were kept in their own ships, which Earth's engineers assessed and stabilized so that life support would remain functional indefinitely. They were treated, in every practical sense, as people in an unwanted situation, rather than as captured opponents. 3 ships at the outer boundary had watched everything from their relay positions. Park gave one instruction about them, delivered through her bridge crew to the edge coverage team at the boundary. Let them go. Make sure they saw everything before they run. They had. The relay ships had been close enough to observe the full engagement from beginning to end. Their sensor records would show every detail. the source of the first fire, the sequence of events, the choice to disable rather than destroy, the presence of boarding teams rather than continued bombardment. Those records went home with the 3 ships. Every decision Park had made was visible in them. She intended that. 2 weeks after the engagement, a Kreth diplomatic representative contacted Earth's communication network. The message was brief, a request for clarification of Earth's intentions, phrased with considerably more care than the original integration notice had been. Park drafted the response herself, in consultation with the Defense Council. It was 3 paragraphs. The first explained that Earth had acted in defense of its sovereignty against an unauthorized military incursion, and that the action had been proportional to the threat presented. The second expressed that Earth bore no ongoing hostility toward the Kreth Collective, and wished to establish peaceful relations on terms of mutual respect. The third paragraph stated that Earth would return the crews of the 14 disabled ships at a mutually agreed handover point, in the same condition in which they had been found, and that Earth hoped this gesture would demonstrate clearly what Earth was, and what it intended to remain. At the end of the third paragraph, after all of that, Park had added one more sentence. She wrote it herself and told the council she wanted it to stay. The sentence said, "We hope this is the beginning of a long and productive relationship between Earth and the wider community of civilizations. We have a great deal to offer, and we have learned, at considerable cost over a long history, how to be good neighbors, but only when our neighbors treat us as equals." The handover happened at a neutral point in the outer system. Every Kreth crew member who had been held on a disabled ship was transferred to a Kreth vessel, unharmed, with a physical copy of Park's letter. The disabled ships themselves were returned as well, minus their weapons systems, which Earth retained as what the Defense Council's legal team classified as evidence of the incursion. 2 months later, the summons from the Galactic Conclave arrived. I had been talking for a long time by the point I reached the handover. The chamber was as still as it had been when I sat down, which told me something about the attention span of alien delegates when the subject matter is sufficiently unusual. Arbiter Sekthal had not moved in a considerable while. His garment was still again. The shifting had stopped. I had come to understand, over the course of my account, that the stillness meant he was concentrating. The shifting was idle behavior. When something demanded his full attention, everything else stopped. "You built a fleet," he said, "without our knowledge." "Without anyone's knowledge," I agreed. "That was the point. And you defeated 17 Kreth enforcement vessels, disabled 14, allowed 3 to leave, and returned the crews, unharmed, with a letter." A pause. "You sent them a letter." Admiral Park wrote it. She felt it was important to communicate clearly that we had no interest in further conflict. The letter said as much. It also included a brief explanation of our reasoning, in case anyone in the Kreth government wanted to understand what had happened from our perspective, rather than simply experiencing it as an outcome. The Sulinix cluster to my left made a sound that the translator rendered as something between confusion and distress. Several of the nodes that composed their collective body were moving in patterns I did not know how to read, but the overall impression was of an entity trying to fit information into categories that had not been designed to hold it. The pellucid delegate, who had not moved or spoken since I sat down, said something that the translator took a moment longer than usual to process. When it came through, the words were, "You chose to return them. This was not a strategic calculation. You chose it because of what you believe." It was not quite a question. I answered it anyway. "Yes," I said. "We believe that the way you end something matters as much as the way you begin it. We did not want war with the Kreth. We still do not. What we wanted was for them, and for everyone, to understand that the choice they made in sending that fleet was built on a mistake. Not a military mistake. An assumption. The assumption that we would not be ready. That assumption needs to not exist anymore. Not for the Kreth. Not for anyone." I looked around the room when I said that last part. I wanted to be clear about who I was speaking to. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. The earlier silences had been stunned. This one had a quality of active thought to it, of a room full of very capable beings working through implications that were not comfortable, arriving at conclusions that required adjustment. Arbiter Sekthal spoke again. The Conclave has a framework for unauthorized fleet construction. There are regulations. With respect, I said. Those regulations apply to Conclave members. We were not members. We were not invited to become members on terms we agreed to. We were processed. A non-response to an integration invitation is not the same as acceptance, and I would suggest this council consider whether that interpretation of its own rules reflects the intention behind them or a particular enforcement habit that has gone unexamined. I kept my voice level. Not cold, just clear. We built our fleet within our own sovereign territory, during a period when we were not under any conclave jurisdiction, in response to a direct and documented external threat. If there is a legal question before this council, it is not about what we built. It is about whether the integration order issued to us by the Kreth Collective was consistent with conclave law. This time the silence was very long. I watched Sekthal. I watched the other delegates. I watched the Kethvari in the back row, the small, quiet species whose clicking translator had been running steadily since the session began. The one seated at the center of their delegation was looking at me with an expression I could not fully interpret, but it did not look like hostility. It looked, if I had to name it, like recognition. I filed that observation away and waited. Eventually, Sekthal asked the question I had been preparing for since before I boarded the transit ship 3 weeks ago. What does humanity want from this council? I had been ready for it. I had prepared in the way you prepare for anything that matters. Not by scripting every word, but by knowing what you actually believe well enough that the words come naturally when the moment arrives. We want the same thing we have always wanted, I said. To be left alone to develop at our own pace, make our own decisions, and determine our own future. We want our sovereignty recognized by this conclave formally and permanently. We want a guarantee that no fleet from any conclave member species will enter our solar system without a formal invitation from Earth's government. And in return, I paused here, because I wanted this to land clearly. We are prepared to join the conclave as full members, on terms that preserve those conditions. We are prepared to trade, to share what we know, to participate in collective decisions where our participation is relevant. We are prepared, under the right framework, to discuss collective security, because we understand that stability benefits everyone, including us. You are prepared to join, Sekthal said slowly, but only on your terms. We are prepared to negotiate terms, I said. That is different from demanding them, but yes, there are conditions that are not open for negotiation. Our sovereignty is one. Our right to maintain an independent defense capability is another. We will not disarm. We will not submit to an integration process that we did not agree to. We will not accept a governance overlay that overrides our own institutions. On every other matter, we are genuinely open to discussion and willing to find workable agreements. A pause. Then, from the back of the room, the Kethvari delegate spoke. The translator took a moment, and the voice that came through was precise and very quiet. 41 years ago, the Kreth Collective sent a fleet to our system. We did not have what you had. We answered the invitation with a counter-proposal, asking for more time to consider the terms. They interpreted that as resistance. We had no preparation. We had nothing. The delegate paused. We have been members of this conclave for 38 years. Our integration was complete before anyone here raised a question about whether the process that produced it was consistent with conclave law. The chamber was completely still. I looked at the Kethvari delegate. They looked back at me. I am sorry, I said, and I meant it with all of it. The delegate made a small movement that the translation system did not try to render. Then they said, "Do not be sorry. Be what you are. We only wish we had been." 2 more delegations spoke after that. Both were small species, both with histories I did not know well enough, but would work to understand in the weeks that followed. Both said things that were careful and quiet, and pointed in the same direction as what the Kethvari had said. The room had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives, not yet visible, but already real and moving toward you. Sekthal called a recess before the formal vote. 2 hours. I spent those 2 hours in a small side room where cold tea had been left for me. I sat with my thoughts, and with a copy of Park's letter, which I had carried in my bag since leaving Earth. I read it again, not because I had forgotten the words, but because I needed to feel the weight of them in that particular moment, in that particular room. 3 paragraphs, and the final sentence at the end, the one she had insisted on including, about being good neighbors, but only to neighbors who treated us as equals. I folded the letter, put it back, and drank the cold tea, and waited. When the session resumed, the vote on Earth's application for conclave membership, with the conditions I had stated, formalized in a preliminary framework that the Council's legal staff had drafted during the recess, passed 14-3. The Vorathi Dominion's allied blocs abstained, citing a need for more time to review the specifics. They were not opposed. They were careful. That was fine. Careful was something I understood. Sekthal himself voted in favor. I noticed that. After the vote, delegates came in small groups. The Pellucid stood in front of me for nearly a full minute without speaking, which I had come to understand was their form of acknowledgement. The Kethvari delegate shook my hand. They had clearly researched the gesture, and said 3 words in translated output. Good. Now stay. I told them we intended to. The transport back to the waiting ship took 40 minutes. I looked out the window at the dead moon getting smaller, at the stars beyond it, at the particular shade of black that space has when you are far from any sun. I thought about Earth, which I would not see again for another 3 weeks. I thought about Caroline Webb and her 2-word message when the fleet was commissioned. It held, as if she knew exactly what the whole thing was, reduced to what was essential. I thought about the Kethvari delegate, about 41 years ago, about having nothing when the moment came. We had not always had something either. For most of our history, we were the ones with nothing but each other and the slow accumulation of understanding that comes from surviving your own worst decisions enough times that you start to learn from them. That understanding was painful to carry. It had cost us a great deal, but when the moment came, it had been exactly what we needed. The transport docked. I stood, stretched, and someone handed me a real cup of hot coffee. I held it with both hands and let the warmth come through. We were going home. For the first time in 8 years, home felt safe. Not because the threat was gone, not because the universe had changed, but because we had stopped being invisible to it. And the thing about becoming visible, about being finally, clearly, undeniably seen as what you actually are, is that once it happens, it cannot unhappen. The Conclave knew what Earth was now. The Kreth Collective knew. The 3 relay ships that had watched everything and carried the record home had made certain of that. We were patient. We were prepared. We would defend ourselves when we had to, and stop when we chose to, and write letters afterward, and mean every word of them. We were here. And we were staying. And the next civilization that wanted to understand us would need to begin from that fact rather than from whatever comfortable assumption had led 17 ships into our system believing they would not need to fight their way back out. I finished the coffee. I found a seat by the viewport. The dead moon fell behind us, and the stars came back in their full number, and I watched them with the feeling of someone who has been somewhere important and is only now beginning to understand all the ways in which it was. There would be more sessions, more negotiations, more careful, patient conversations, in rooms that smelled of ozone and old stone. There would be trade discussions and security framework talks, and long debates about what collective membership actually meant when one of the members had spent 6 years building a secret fleet inside an asteroid belt. There would be complicated days, but the first day was done, and the first day was the one that mattered most, because it was the one where the world found out what we were. Not what they had assumed, not what they had been told, but what we actually were. A species with a long and complicated history, and a deep and genuine preference for peace, and the demonstrated willingness and capability to protect that preference when someone decided to test it. Arbiter Sekthal had said something to me just before I left the chamber. He said it quietly, after the delegations had mostly dispersed, while his staff was gathering the session's documentation. He said, We have never had a first contact session quite like this one. I told him I imagined not. He said, most species, when they come before this council for the first time, are asking for something. Protection, recognition, resources. They come with needs. He paused. You came with a record. We came with a story, I said. The record was the evidence. He looked at me for a moment. Then his garment began shifting color again, slowly, resuming whatever process my presence had interrupted. Yes, he said. I suppose it was. I thought about that exchange on the long way home, about what it means to be seen as you are, rather than as what someone expected, about how long we had worked for exactly that, not for victory, though we had won, and not for recognition, though we had earned it, but for the simple fact of existing in this wider universe on our own terms, understood correctly, prepared properly, with the quiet knowledge that the thing we had built in the dark had held when the light finally came. It had held. That was enough. That was, in the end, exactly everything.